Wyoming Territory, August 1879. The wind kicked dust through the alley behind the general store in Laramie as Jackson Judd swung down from his horse, boots crunching against dry gravel. He had barely tied off the reins when he caught sight of movement near the barrels beside the back wall, too small to be a dog, too quiet to be a thief. Then he saw her. A woman, thin and pale beneath a sun-faded bonnet, was bent over a wooden crate of discarded scraps. Her dress was patched in more places than not, and her shoulders trembled as she shifted through moldy rinds and broken tins. Jackson's hand stilled at his belt. "Ma'am," he said, voice low but steady. She startled, looking up. Her eyes were wide, dark, and tired, far too tired for someone who could not have been more than 25. A smudge of dirt traced her cheek, and her lips were chapped raw. "I ain't stealing," she said fast. "I'm just looking for anything we can eat." Jackson stepped closer, brows drawn. My child," she said, straightening. "My son, he has not eaten in 2 days." Those words hit like a gunshot. Jackson's jaw tightened. He had seen hard times, cattle drives through blizzards, friends buried in shallow graves, but hunger in a child's eyes was worse than all of it. "What's your name?" he asked, gentler now. "Delaney Finch," she said, eyes flicking to the street as if expecting someone to drag her away. "I came from Cheyenne, was supposed to meet someone here, but he never showed." Jackson nodded once. "Where's your boy?" "Back behind the stables," she said. "I told him to wait. His name's Zeke." Jackson looked her over again. The way she stood tall despite her thin frame, firm even in desperation, it struck him deep. She was not weak, she was just worn out. "All right," he said. "Come with me." Her fingers curled, wary. "Why, I got food," he said. "Place to sit. Let the boy eat, rest, then we will talk about what comes next." She hesitated only a moment before following. Jackson led her down the alley and through the back door of the saloon. It was early, the place half empty, quiet. He waved off the barkeep and went straight to the kitchen. "Make a plate," he told the cook. "Bread, beans, whatever is hot, and pour some milk." Delaney stood stiff behind him like she did not know how to be inside a building anymore. When the plate came, Jackson handed it to her. "Go get him," he said. She truly ran, and came back minutes later with a boy no older than 6. Zeke's ribs showed through his shirt, his face pinched, but he clung to his mother's hand and looked up at Jackson with big, wary eyes. Jackson crouched. "Food's for you." The boy looked to Delaney. She nodded, tears in her eyes, and he climbed onto a stool. Delaney sat beside him, watching him eat like it was the only thing keeping her breathing. Jackson let them be for a minute. Then he slid onto the seat across from her. "Where's your people?" "Gone," she said. "My folks died of the fever 2 winters back. The man I came to meet, he said he had work for me. I thought it was true." Jackson's stomach turned. "He left you here with nothing," she nodded. "Said he would come back after settling cattle east of town." "I waited a week. Then the boarding house lady said I had to leave. No money left. We've been sleeping behind the livery ever since." Zeke finished his food and leaned against Delaney, already half asleep. "He is a good boy," she whispered, brushing his hair back. "He never cries. Even when his belly's empty." Jackson looked at the both of them and felt something shift in his chest. He did not know this woman or her story beyond what she had told him, but he knew what he saw, and that was someone who had not given up, even when the world tried to break her. "You can stay at my place," he said. Delaney stared at him. "What? I have a cabin west of town, just me and my horse. It is not much, but it is clean, safe. You and Zeke can stay there until you figure out your plans." Her eyes narrowed. "Why would you do that?" He met her gaze. "Because no one ought to be digging through trash to feed their child." Silence stretched for a long moment. Then she looked down at Zeke, then back at Jackson. "All right," she said. "Just for a little while." Jackson stood. "We will head out in the morning. I will get you a room tonight." "You both need sleep more than anything." She nodded slowly. "Thank you." He tipped his hat. "You are welcome, Delaney." As he walked her and Zeke across the street to the boarding house, Jackson felt something settle in his chest, something quiet, something solid. He had not expected anything from this day except dust and noise. But now, with this woman and her boy beside him, the world felt different, like maybe something good had just started. The frost had not yet come, but morning brought a biting edge to the Wyoming wind. Jackson's horse, Blue, stood saddled outside the boarding house, stamping his hooves against the packed dirt. Jackson waited at the bottom of the steps, one hand resting on the saddle horn, his coat collar turned up against the cold. Delaney appeared in the doorway with Zeke wrapped tight in a wool shawl. Her bonnet was gone, replaced by a knitted scarf that had seen better years. She carried a worn flour sack slung over one shoulder, her belongings, he guessed, light enough to not trouble her step. "You sleep all right?" Jackson asked, not looking directly at her. "We did," she answered, adjusting the sack. "Thank you." Zeke rubbed at his eyes but stayed close to her side. Jackson crouched and offered the boy a strip of dried apple from his coat pocket. "Long ride," he said. "This'll help." Zeke took it without a word and began chewing. Delaney gave Jackson a long look as if weighing something private, then nodded once. They rode out slow, Jackson in the lead, Delaney behind with the boy in front of her. The town faded behind them, replaced by open prairie and the faint line of hills far west. The trail bent through cottonwoods clustered along a shallow creek, their leaves already touched gold. A pair of crows lifted off a fence post as they passed, cawing into the wind. "How far?" Delaney asked, voice low behind him. "Couple hours," Jackson said. "Longer with a child, but we'll make it before midday." They didn't speak more after that, the quiet between them filled by the steady rhythm of hooves and the sigh of wind through the grass. Jackson kept his eyes forward but listened. Zeke made no complaint. Delaney didn't ask for rest. When they reached the cabin, the sun had climbed above the ridgeline, and the woodpile out front cast a narrow shadow. The house sat tucked into a fold of low hills, shielded from wind by a stand of pine. It was small, one room with a lean-to shed out back but sturdy. The porch creaked as Jackson stepped up and unlocked the door. He pushed it open to let them in first. Delaney stopped just inside, her eyes tracing the space: wood stove, narrow bed, table, shelves lined with tin dishes and dried herbs strung from nails. She didn't speak. Zeke wandered to a window, peering out at the fenced corral and the rough-built chicken coop against the pines. "I'll take the bedroll," Jackson said, setting it down near the stove. "You two can have the bed, it's clean." Delaney turned to face him. "You sure about this?" "I wouldn't have brought you if I wasn't." She looked at the boy, then back at Jackson. "I can do chores. Wash, cook, feed stock. I won't stop you." She held his gaze a moment longer, then crossed to the table and set her sack down. Jackson stepped outside to unsaddle the horses. The rest of the day passed in quiet work. Jackson cleared out the shed and split fresh wood. Delaney took to the stove, boiling beans with salt pork and laying out a clean cloth for supper. Zeke followed the hens around the yard, his small boots kicking up dust. Later, as the sun dropped behind the ridge, Jackson came in to find the table set with 3 bowls and a jug of water. Delaney stood by the window, sleeves rolled to her elbows, her hands still damp from washing. "Smells good," Jackson said, removing his hat. "I used what you had. Hope it's all right." He sat down. "It's more than all right." They ate without much talk. Zeke finished first and fell asleep curled on the floor by the stove. Delaney picked at the last of her beans, her eyes distant. Jackson leaned back in his chair. "What is he like?" She looked up. "Zeke," he nodded, drawing. "He finds charcoal stubs and marks rocks with them. Back in Cheyenne, he'd draw horses on the back of feed sacks." Jackson stood, crossed to a shelf, and returned with a half-used ledger and a stub of pencil. "Might not be rocks, but he can use these." Delaney took them, her fingers brushing his just once. "You didn't have to do that. I know." She folded the ledger against her chest. "He won't forget it." Outside, coyotes called in the hills. Jackson banked the fire and rolled out his bed near the door. Delaney settled Zeke on the mattress, pulling the wool shawl over him, then lay down beside him, eyes open against the ceiling. Jackson lay still, listening to the wind run its fingers through the pine boughs. "Jackson," she said softly across the dark. "Yeah, you live out here alone because you want to," he thought a long moment. "It's easier sometimes." She was quiet a while, then said, "Maybe it is, but easier don't mean better." He didn't answer, but he didn't sleep either, not for a long time. The next day broke with a low haze hanging over the hills, the kind that softened the sky and made the world feel hushed. Delaney stepped out of the cabin with a pail in hand, her boots damp from the dew that clung to the grass. The flock of hens scattered as she approached, and she crouched to gather their eggs, tucking each one gently into her apron. She hadn't asked permission. She didn't need to. The rhythm of survival came without discussion. Do what needs doing. When she returned inside, Jackson was repairing the latch on the shed door, sleeves rolled, hands steady. He didn't glance up when she passed, but she saw the brief lift of his brow. Not surprise, approval. Zeke was still sleeping, curled with the pencil clutched in one hand and the ledger half full already with shapes that looked like horses mid-run. Delaney set the eggs on the table and stirred the coals back to life. The heat felt good on her raw fingers. Jackson came in without a word, placed a small bundle of freshly skinned rabbit on the counter, and washed his hands in the basin. She watched him through the corner of her eye, the way he moved without waste, as if every task had a purpose and no part of him belonged to anything idle. "You trapped that yourself?" she asked, brushing flour across the table. "Snare up by the ridge, saw tracks yesterday," he said. "You cook?" "I do, not fancy, but it fills a belly," he nodded once. "That'll do." She cleaned and seasoned the meat while he took the boy out to the corral. Through the window, she saw them kneel near a patch of dirt while Jackson showed Zeke how to drive a stake into the ground. The boy mimicked him, focused, while Jackson handed him a strand of twine and showed him how to knot it. By the time the meal was ready, Zeke's cheeks were red from the cold and his hands smudged with earth. He ate slow, watching Jackson between bites the way children do when they're still deciding if a man is safe. Afterward, Jackson pulled a stack of firewood into the lean-to, and Delaney stood in the doorway, wiping her hands on her skirt. "I can take on sewing," she said, "if you know anyone needs mending. I've done shirts, saddles, straps, even boots if the leather ain't too far gone." He leaned the last of the wood against the wall. "There's a widow down the river bend, keeps bees, always fretting over torn netting. I'll ride down tomorrow, ask her." Delaney nodded. She stepped down from the porch and stood a few paces from him. "You always live this quiet." He rested a hand on the doorframe. "Quiet's not empty, it just don't shout." She looked out at the hills where the trees bled into the sky. "I never minded quiet. But it's different when you ain't the only one listening to it." Jackson didn't answer that. He didn't have to. She turned and stepped inside, brushing Zeke's hair back where he sat on the floor tracing a new sketch. That night, as the light faded into a soft indigo, Jackson brought a lantern onto the porch and sat on the step with a whetstone in one hand and his knife in the other. The scraping sound was steady, like breath. Inside, Delaney hummed under her breath as she folded washcloths and tucked them into the crate she'd cleared for her and Zeke's things. When she finally stepped out, she held a cup of hot water with a pinch of mint from the bundle hanging near the stove. "I thought you might want something warm," she said, holding it out. He took it without speaking and sipped. After a moment, he said, "Used to be my brother sat here evenings. He talked more than me, told stories about the war, about women in scent. Louis who wore perfume like armor. What happened to him?" she asked. "Died in Dakota Territory. Fever took him fast." She sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap. "My sister drowned crossing a creek 2 springs ago. Ice broke under her wagon. She had a laugh like bells. Zeke still asks if she's coming back." Neither of them looked at the other. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It settled around them like a blanket pulled up against the cold. "You mind if I wash your shirt tomorrow?" she asked. "The one with the tear near the cuff." He looked down at it, rubbed his thumb along the frayed edge. "Reckon I don't." She stood after a while and reached for the door. "Delaney," he said before she could step inside. She paused. "I'm glad you knocked on that crate behind the store." She looked at him a long moment. "I didn't knock, you just saw." He nodded once. "Either way, I'm glad." She didn't answer, but her eyes softened. Then she disappeared inside and the door clicked shut behind her. Jackson sat alone for a while longer, the mug still warm in his hands, and the stars beginning to prick through the dark like quiet promises. By late September, the wind shifted. It no longer carried the dry heat of August, but something sharper, a quiet warning of the winter to come. The pine needles turned brittle underfoot, and the creek behind the cabin slowed to a sluggish trickle, its edges rimmed with morning frost. Delaney stood outside with her sleeves rolled and a wooden paddle in hand, stirring soap into a wash basin propped on a stump. Her hands were red to the wrist, but she didn't pause. Each shirt, each sock scrubbed and wrung out, she laid on the line strung between two posts Jackson had set up days earlier without saying a word about it. Inside, Jackson knelt over the floorboards near the stove, sliding a folded canvas sack under the bed. He'd just returned from town with supplies: flour, salt, a slab of smoked pork. He hadn't asked her what she needed. He'd watched what ran low and brought it. Zeke sat cross-legged on the floor, tongue between his teeth, sketching with two pencils now Jackson had sharpened another for him last week. What had started as horses had grown into cabins, hills, and even a rough shape that looked like Blue, Jackson's gelding, with one ear longer than the other. When Delaney came in, shaking water from her hands, Jackson straightened up, brushing sawdust from his trousers. "There's a blacksmith's boy in town," he said. "Broke his arm, can't run errands. I told the smith you could take on delivery work, sew up leather pouches for bits and nails." Delaney dried her hands on the rag by the stove. "How much is he offering?" "2 bits a week. Maybe more if you mend his wife's apron strings." Zeke looked up. "Can I come?" Jackson crossed the room and crouched beside him. "You stay here, help your ma, I'll take the packages." Delaney's eyes narrowed slightly. "You're offering to carry my work back and forth." Jackson stood. "You've got enough to do." She leaned against the table. "You sure it's not just an excuse to check whether I'm keeping your shirts in good repair?" His lip twitched. "I haven't complained, have I?" She smiled into her shoulder and turned to fetch the empty flour tin. "I can have the first pouch stitched by Thursday." That night, after Zeke was asleep, his sketchbook tucked under his arm, breathing slow and steady, Delaney stepped out onto the porch. Jackson was already there, boots propped on the railing, a match burning down between his fingers as he lit the lantern beside the door. She pulled her shawl tighter and sat beside him, the air cool enough to bite the tips of her ears. "He asked today if we'd be staying through the winter," she said. Jackson didn't move. "What did you tell him?" "I said I didn't know." He looked out across the dark stretch of grass and stone. "I'd like you to." She drew her knees up beneath the shawl. "You don't know what you're asking." "I do." Delaney was quiet for a long time. The wind stirred the trees, and somewhere far off an owl called once and was answered. "I didn't come here to be taken in," she said finally. "I came because I had no other place to go." "There's a difference." "You think I don't know that?" She turned to him. "Then why haven't you asked for anything in return?" Jackson's jaw shifted, but his voice stayed even. "Because you don't owe me anything." She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "That doesn't make sense." "It does to me." She let the silence stretch between them, heavy and close. "I've been waiting for you to ask for something," she said. "Anything? A reason I should be wary." Jackson reached for the lantern, adjusted the flame. "I told you the truth the day I met you. I saw a mother feeding her child the best way she could. That was enough." Delaney studied his face, the creases near his eyes, the way his mouth held steady even when the rest of him was still. She didn't speak again, but she didn't go inside either. She stayed. When he rose to check the latch on the barn, she followed him down the steps. The moon hung low, casting long shadows over the yard. He paused at the gate, one hand on the crossbeam, and turned toward her. "Stay through the winter," he said. "Not because you have nowhere else. Stay because it's warmer here, with us." Delaney looked past him at the cabin, a dull glow spilling through the window. Inside, her son slept soundly, full and safe. The cold pressed against her back, but it didn't reach her skin. "I'll stay," she said. "But not just the winter." He met her eyes, and something shifted between them, quiet and steady, like a seed taking root beneath frozen ground. "All right," he said. "Then we'll build something for spring." The first snow came early that October, brushing the cabin roof and fence posts with a thin veil of white. It melted by midday, but the message was clear: winter would not wait. Jackson spent the morning reinforcing the barn door with new hinges and adding pitch to the roofline where the melt had dripped inside last spring. Delaney, without being asked, had begun cutting strips from an old feed sack to make window draft stoppers, stuffing them with dried moss from the creek. Inside, Zeke sat by the hearth, his legs crossed beneath him as he traced lines across a fresh page. Jackson had carved him a new pencil from a willow branch, shaving it smooth and leaving the bark near the top so Zeke's fingers wouldn't slip. The boy had drawn a tree line that looked near identical to the one behind the cabin. Above it, a shape like smoke curled from a square roof. Delaney stepped in from the shed, brushing snow from her shoulders. "There's a fox denning beneath the woodpile," she said. "I saw her tracks. She's small, likely young." Jackson nodded once. "I'll leave her be long as she doesn't bother the hens. She's not the bothersome kind. Just looking to survive." He met her eyes, and something passed between them, quiet and understood. That night, they shared the last of the summer apples baked with a touch of lard and cinnamon. Delaney had dug the spice from the bottom of a tin Jackson didn't even remember owning. She slid a plate toward him, then sat at the table, resting her elbows beside Zeke as he leaned into her side, already blinking slower with sleep. Jackson took a bite and looked up. "You made this same kind of pie before." "Not exactly," she said. "The taste's close to what my sister used to make. She always pinched the edges. I never could do it the same." "You did just fine." Delaney brushed a loose strand from Zeke's forehead, then looked at Jackson. "I've been thinking about spring." He set down his fork. "What about it, if we're still here? I'd like to plant something. Beans, maybe potatoes, something that roots deep." Jackson leaned back, arms crossed over his chest. "So you're staying?" "I'm not looking for another place," she said, "and I think Zeke's already planted himself." He nodded slowly. "Then we'll turn the ground come thaw." "I've got seed tucked away from last year." She smiled, but it was soft and serious. "You sure about this, Jackson? About us being part of it?" He stood, crossed to the stove, and checked the kettle. Then he turned and met her eyes fully. "I've lived quiet for a long time. But since you came, the quiet's changed. It's not hollow anymore. It sounds like something growing." Delaney stood too, moving toward him. "I was afraid to believe in anything lasting, but I believe in you." Jackson reached for her hand, rough palm to hers, and held it without rush. "I want you here," he said. "Not just through winter. I want to build this life with you, if you'll have it." She pressed her forehead to his, her voice barely above a whisper. "I will." They stood like that a long while, the fire throwing ribbons of gold across the walls, Zeke asleep behind them, the wind outside gentled by snow. Months passed. The snow deepened, then receded. The cabin held firm through the cold, the walls lined with warmth that came not just from the stove, but from the steady routines of their new life. Jackson taught Zeke to set snares and check fence lines. Delaney mended not only clothes from neighboring ranches, but also the seams in her own heart and in Jackson's, though neither of them spoke of it outright. By the time the first crocuses pushed through the thawed earth, the ground behind the cabin was tilled and ready. Delaney knelt beside Zeke, showing him how to bury seed with care, while Jackson fetched water from the creek. On days when the wind blew soft, they'd sit on the porch while Zeke sketched the world as it changed buds on branches, birds returning, the silhouette of the man and woman who had become his home. One morning in early May, Delaney stepped out into the sunlight wearing a simple muslin dress, her hair braided and pinned at the nape of her neck. Jackson stood waiting beneath the cottonwood behind the barn, a small carved ring in his hand, ashwood, smooth and pale, shaped by hours of quiet work by firelight. They exchanged vows with only Zeke and the trees as witnesses. No preacher, no paper, just two hands joined and a promise spoken true. Afterward, they shared a meal beneath the open sky, bread, beans, and a small jar of honey gifted by the widow down the bend. Zeke ran laughing through the tall grass, his joy unshaped by memory, full only of the day. That night, Jackson lay beside Delaney beneath the same roof where she'd once hesitated to trust him. Her hand rested against his chest, her breath warm against his shoulder. "You happy?" he asked, voice low. "I'm home," she said. "That's more than happy." He kissed her temple, then settled in as the wind moved through the pines outside, steady and sure. In time, they planted not just beans and potatoes, but squash and corn. Jackson built a second room onto the cabin with help from a neighbor. Zeke learned to read letters from the books Delaney had bartered for with her sewing. In the evenings, he'd sit between them, reading aloud while the fire crackled and the day faded. There were hard days, of course a blight on the corn one summer, a cow lost in a storm, but they faced each one together, never turning away. Jackson's hands, always steady, found her waist each morning, her shoulder each night. Delaney's laughter returned, not like bells, but like river waiter low, moving, constant. They grew old in that house, and the hills grew familiar with their footprints. Zeke, grown tall, married a schoolteacher from downriver and built his own home not far off, always returning on Sundays to sit at the same table where once he'd drawn with broken pencils. And when Jackson and Delaney looked out at the land they'd made into a life, it was with quiet hearts and clasped hands. No words needed. Everything true had already been said in the spaces between winters, in the soil turned by both their hands, in the deep, abiding love that never needed proving. They had built something lasting, and they never had to be alone again.